Hi, good day everyone. I'm Dr. Neptune-Figaro, and I'm here to talk to you today about transnational organized crime. But specifically, I'm going to look at the drug-crime relationship and how this leads into drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is actually a significant component of organized crimes. So we're going to look at this relationship to have a better explanation of drug trafficking and how it leads to transnational organized crime. So specifically today, we're going to talk about, or we're going to explain these four key objectives for this session. The first would be to explain the relationship between drugs and crime. And then we're going to just identify three risk factors associated with drug use and criminal behavior. And in doing so, I'm going to introduce to you the Tripartite Conceptual Model, because this actually looks at violence and drug use and offers some explanation for this relationship that happens. And all of this is to explain drug trafficking, especially within the Caribbean and Latin American countries, and to have a greater understanding of what happens when it comes to drugs and how it becomes global and how Trinidad and Tobago is involved. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is really and truly this link that we have with crime and drugs. Now, when people talk about drugs and crime, they generally look at crime and drugs as being a very straightforward explanation. The general perception of the relationship is that drug use leads to criminality, but this link is actually far more complex, and it actually is a more dynamic than we think about. It falls into three main categories, and these are the categories I have identified in this slide. The first would be the drug-defying crimes, and this actually involves the sale and possession of illegal substances. The second would be the drug-defying crimes, and this involves behaviors induced by the effects of drugs and illegal activity, and is actually motivated by continued drug use. The third is crimes associated with drug use and involve illegal activities that occur when the person is involved or under the influence of illegal substances. And the definition shows that you don't really have to have doesn't have to have a direct result of the drug use, but in its essence, it's under the influence of the drug use. Now, so given this relationship between drugs and crime, the tripartite model tends to explain or go into depth a little bit further about explaining the relationship between drugs and violence, and it shows three ways in which it's related. Now, the first one is the pharmacological model, and this model actually looks at drug use and violence and how when somebody uses drugs, either short-term or long-term, the drugs may allow them, or they may become more excitable, more irritable, or more rational. Now, this may result in some violent behavior, and the drugs that are generally more relevant in these situations would be alcohol and other stimulants such as LSD and ecstasy. Now, the second model that is explained by the tripartite conceptual model is the economically compulsive violence. Now, this model actually maintains that some individual substance users engage in violent crime, such as robbery, just to support their drug use. So when you look at heroin and cocaine, they are very expensive drugs, and they are often associated with compulsive use. And these substances are actually important within this model. So individuals within this model are essentially motivated by economic incentives, money that drives them so that they would become more in touch with the drugs rather than their impulses to act violently. Now, the last and important model that we will look at is the systematic violence. And the reason why it is important to this class is because this is the introduction to why people get involved in violence when it comes to drug trafficking. So this model is associated with drug distribution and drug use. So the violence is associated with the marketing of illicit drugs. So you talk about dispute over territories where persons should sell versus somebody else, dispute over drugs. You talk about retaliation by drug users, people who don't pay their drug dealers. So this is one of the important systematic violence because it's actually put into a system. This makes drug use and the violence associated looks like a business or organization. Now, this is important when we look at explaining drug trafficking and why it has been such a prolific yet very dangerous transnational organized crime. So drug trafficking within the Caribbean and Latin American countries is a very significant topic. And before I actually explain this and go into depth about the 5 key factors about drug trafficking in the region, I want to actually just give you a key explanation of what drug trafficking is. Now, drug trafficking is global, meaning it is really transnational. It transcends borders, so it is not localized. And it is illicit trade, so it is illegal, but it also includes the cultivation, manufacture, and distribution and sale of substances which are subject to drug prohibition laws. Now, one of the key reasons why, one of the key factors that I'm going to bring up with regards to drug trafficking is the first thing is that drug trafficking was actually originated from economic hardships that was experienced within nations that became independent within the 1970s and the 1980s. So at a time there was economic depression and drugs emerged, politically and economically significant. You had a bunch of people who are rural growers, like people in rural areas, that used drugs as capital. This illicit trade expanded as the economy started to grow, and sometimes it threatened the political order of things, but it actually became very prevalent in especially economically deprived areas within the region. So the other thing we'll look at is that while drug trafficking and dealing tend to be strongly associated with some categories of violent crime, drug use tend to be primarily, but not exclusively, associated with property crimes. So, especially in areas where there was violent crimes, yes, there were an increase in violent crimes, but you also saw an increase and higher likelihood of property crimes happening. And this is because the robberies and the drug using lifestyle increased property crimes as well. So even though violence increased in a lot of areas that had or were involved in the drug trade, you would have also seen a simultaneous increase in property crimes as well. The third thing that we're going to look at in terms of the key factors with regards to the drug trafficking and in Latin American and Caribbean countries is that the illegal drugs were the highest in the market. So when you look at this chart here, you would see that you have illicit markets as well, and you have the diamonds, firearms, human beings, which is human trafficking, and drugs. Now, the high value is understandable because unlike human beings and diamonds and firearms, the drug supply is consumed, so it's a consumable. It's a renewable item each year, and it has to be continuously renewed. So the main illicit drugs are opiates, which is actually heroin, and they have cocaine, and then you have cannabis. But then you also have drugs like amphetamine, and you also have methamphetamines and ecstasy circulating in the illicit drug markets. So drugs are generally the highest illicit market. The UN, which is the United Nations, estimates that some 200 million people, that is actually 4.8% of the world's population, use illegal drugs annually, with 25 million being classed as problematic users, which is actually 0.6% of the population. So factor number 4 would be that Latin American and the Caribbean are viewed as primary security threats to particularly the United States and European countries, because these territories are the main producers and traffickers of popular illicit drugs such as cocaine, marijuana, opiates, which will be heroin, and methamphetamines. So in recent decades, Latin American countries have played a central role in several global illicit markets. Multiple aspects of the drug supply chain takes place in the region, including one, the crop cultivation. So in a lot of Latin American countries, they cultivate the crop. Then you have the production of the crop. And then you have the drug trafficking and ultimately drug consumption. So South America is the sole producer of cocaine in the global market. You have Mexico and Colombia. They are actually the primary sources of the opioids, and that is heroin. And you have Mexico and the Caribbean. They are major sources of cannabis, especially Jamaica. And they are consumed in the United States. And Mexico is a primary source of foreign amphetamines in the United States. So this is why they are so much of a threat to the United States and Europe. But what is even more interesting is that major drug crops in Latin America, such as the coca bush, they use and produce cocaine and opioid poppies. And these actually produce opiates, which actually is heroin. So the source zones of the coca bush is actually in South America, particularly in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Drug processing and refining may take place in source zones, but there's also these transit routes that are actually taken through the Caribbean to get these to the Latin American and Caribbean countries. The last thing we'll talk about, so I have an actual map of how it is designed in terms of looking at where drugs are trafficked within the region. You have Latin American countries on one hand, but you also have them being the producers and the manufacturer of drugs. But these little islands within the Caribbean here on your right generally are the islands that transport or are used to transport drugs to other areas and nations of the world. And the last thing is, which actually ties in well with looking at that map, is that there's a strategic pathway in trafficking drugs to in the Americas. So I have put here a map of these trafficking pathways, and they are very important because this is why they are a security threat, the Caribbean and Latin American countries. Because the primary pathway today for illegal drugs entering the United States from abroad is through Central America and the Mexico corridor. But traffickers appear to also be using overland smuggling. They also use maritime, which is the sea, and they actually do short distance aerial trafficking to transport from South America and to other countries throughout the world, and generally in Latin American countries. When we look at the Caribbean and South America, South Florida route, it generally is very active, but the Caribbean plays a part because Venezuela has become a major transit point for drugs through the Caribbean, particularly Haiti and Dominican Republic. And they actually transport it to the United States and Europe. So besides going to the United States, Latin American countries particularly transport drugs, particularly cocaine, and they ship it to Europe as well. And Europe has other transit points in which they go to West Africa and other nations of the world. Now, elsewhere in the Caribbean, such as Bahamas, Trinidad, Barbados, they also serve as transit points for both Jamaica and South America, cocaine, heroin, as well as marijuana. So these trafficking pathways are very important when you look at the drug trafficking transit areas within the Caribbean and region. So thank you very much for listening. I hope it was very informative. Do have a great day, and let me know if you have any questions.